Okay. All right, we'll get started. Okay, so this is Stats 101C, Statistical Learning and Data Mining. I am still writing my syllabus. I have to figure out exactly how the grades will be calculated. That's the part I'm trying to work out. I'll give you a general guideline idea. We'll have homework, and then we'll have a final exam on the last day of class, and then and there will also be a final project, which will probably be run on Kaggle, and probably those three will have fairly equal weights, 30%, 30 to 35% each, something around there. And then a few extra points here and there for like attendance and stuff like that. This is my very first time teaching the class. So I normally stay in the 102 series, but the opportunity to teach the class for 101C came up, and I thought it could be fun. I like the topic and stuff, and so just bear with me as I work out some of these kinks and stuff. And it's also summer, so it's like compressed, and so we're gonna move very quickly. This is the textbook that we are going to use, An Introduction to Statistical Learning. You can get it free online. You just type in Introduction to Statistical Learning, okay? And the very first web page is the author's web page, and he offers the book for free as a PDF, okay? So they are just giving the book away as far as the PDF goes. So you're not doing anything illegal by getting the free version of the thing, okay? If you want the hard copy, you have to purchase the hard copy somewhere, okay? But I didn't put any order at the bookstore because I figured 99, like maybe all but one of you will just use the digital version, okay? But anyway, this is the textbook that we'll use. I'm going to follow it very, very, very closely. Pretty much each lecture, I'm just going to be working through each of these, like, the content in here, and then and during the TA sections, the TA will work through each chapter. Kind of has a lab and stuff, and they'll kind of work through that, and then I'm going to assign homework straight out of the textbook as well, okay? And I think the homework problems are very good, okay? I do have to say something, though. Because the homework problems are from the textbook, a lot of people have produced homework answers, and if you just search online, you can easily find answers to your homework, all right? Now, I want to strongly encourage you not to go straight to the homework answers, okay? When you learn by doing and by struggling, right? It's a lot like working out or playing a sport or something, okay? If you work out at the gym, as soon as you face any resistance, if you say, okay, I'm done, I'm gonna have somebody else lift these weights for me, you are not gonna get stronger, right? And the same thing happens when you do homework problems, right? You might be able to do stuff that's easy, and then you might hit something that's hard, and then if you say, well, I don't know how to do this, I'm gonna just look at the answers, you're basically having somebody else do the heavy lifting for you, and you're not gonna get stronger. And so I want to encourage you to kind of work through the hard problems, okay? And so that's that. After you're done, you want to like check your answers and stuff. I guess that's fine, okay? Again, I don't want you to get in the habit of like doing one problem and then checking your answers, and then doing a problem and then checking your answers, because there's that's like habit forming. It's like not doing drugs, but it's, you don't want to like get your brains to release these chemicals that say like, oh, I did it right because I checked the answers, because come test time, then you're in trouble. So anyway, homework will come out of the textbook. Try to do them on your own. Try not to just copy the solutions out there, or look at your friends' solutions or things like that. And oh yeah, okay, so this is everything that I said there. Okay, and then and I'll finalize the syllabus and I'll get that posted, and then I'll get the kind of the first homework assignment posted probably tomorrow. Okay. All right. So today we'll work through chapter 2, and this is kind of an introduction to the course. And I mean, I guess chapter 1 is the introduction. And chapter 1 just kind of says like, this is kind of, I guess we can just kind of flip through some of these pages, but we'll start with the chapter 2 as far as real material goes. Okay, so introduction to statistical learning. So this is our textbook. Okay, and then I have an ambitious schedule planned for us. Okay, I'm hoping to cover the entire textbook in our 6 weeks here. Okay, and I think we can do it. I think we can do it. All right. Don't get scared. I'll obviously have to pick and choose a few things to like skip and stuff, but we'll get through it. Okay. Please do your reading. Okay. The textbook's very good. So, and I think it's written at an accessible level. Okay. So do your reading. On Wednesday, we will cover chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a very long chapter, and if we didn't already have 101A, everyone's taken 101A, right? It's like a prereq for this class. We would spend a lot longer on chapter 3, but everything in chapter 3 should be review, but I recognize it might have been a little while back since you've taken 101A. So we'll spend just Wednesday going through all of chapter 3 very quickly, but almost all of it should be review. So I'm going to just kind of fly through it, but it should be quick. And then yeah, we're going to get into classification methods. We'll talk logistic regression, linear discriminant analysis. Where do you guys cover logistic regression? 101A? Only a tiny part. Okay. Well, I guess you'll get it again in 101C, but only a tiny part. So, so you'll see this again. Okay. It's classification stuff. So we'll cover that. LDA is it's another kind of classification method, and we'll cover that. And then we will see cross-validation and bootstrap in chapter 5. I cover cross-validation in 102B and bootstrap in 102A. And I don't know if you guys have taken those courses yet or not, but you'll kind of get it from this textbook's perspective. We'll also look at kind of subset model selection things, okay? And so you have subset selection, which I believe was covered in 101A, kind of your stepwise forward and stepwise backwards subset selection. And then we have shrinkage methods, ridge regression, and lasso, which you've seen in 102B if you've taken 102B. And then there's also dimension reductions. These are just kind of different ideas for model selection, and we'll cover all of these things. Whoops, wrong button. And then we'll look at some spline functions for kind of doing smoothing splines. Did you guys cover local regression in 101A? Lois? Did not cover that? Okay, all right. So we'll look at local regression. And then generalized additive models, it's like a generalization of linear regression, okay? And then we'll look at tree-based methods, decision trees and random forests and all of that. And then we'll look at support vector machines and stuff. If you've taken 102B with me, a lot of these topics look familiar or like you've seen these before. The difference between this class and 102B is that this is, we talk more about the methods generally in terms of their applications and their usage, whereas in 102B, I force you guys to write some code in terms of doing the algorithms yourself. Okay, so in 102B, you actually learn the algorithms and code these things up. In this class, we're not going to be coding anything ourselves in terms of writing the algorithms, but we'll be using R and kind of the packaged versions of these functions. Okay, so we'll start with statistical learning, and this is kind of an outline of what we'll cover today. So we'll talk about what is statistical learning, and then we'll talk about assessing model accuracy, and there's a bit to cover there. Okay, so the big picture idea in statistical learning, and some people will call this machine learning. There's like a technical difference between statistical learning and machine learning. The textbook uses statistical learning, but there's a lot of similar ideas here, okay? I guess the statistical learning emphasizes the statistical part of these methods. And the idea is you've got some data, okay? Generally, you've got input and output, okay? Input is X, output is Y. Usually output is a single value, okay? And then your input, you might have a bunch of different variables coming in, okay? So an example will be something like, let's predict the cost of a house, okay? And so the output will be the cost of the house. The input variables will be things like, how many bedrooms is the house? How many square feet is the house? You know, when was the house built? Where's the neighborhood that the house is located in, you know? How much are the houses around this house? You know, you've got all of these different variables that factor in to how much this house might cost, right? So what statistical learning is, you know, can we figure out the relationship between X and Y, all right? So, you know, our general knowledge regarding houses is that bigger houses cost more, houses in Beverly Hills cost more, houses in some other part of the neighborhood might cost less, right? And so, you know, we have this kind of general knowledge, but can we figure out the actual relationship that exists between X and Y? You know, can we figure out each variable's impact? Or maybe we're not so interested in that. Maybe we just want to predict good values and things like that. This is kind of the big picture idea. And it's not just housing prices. It could be something like, you know, let's predict how much money this movie is going to make, right? You know, how much money should we spend on the advertising campaign because we want to know how much our sales will increase. So there's all sorts of problems where we want to make predictions and things based on data that we have. And so anyway, our input we'll call predictors and features, and then the output we'll call the response. Okay, and so the general idea is you've got some kind of model, okay? A model is just a simplified mathematical representation of something that exists in the real world, right? So if we're talking about something like can we predict, I don't know, how tall someone is based on other variables like their gender and their age and how tall their parents are and how tall their siblings are and how much milk they drink as a kid or something like that. There's like a real biological process that goes into like how bones are built and things are built and determines ultimately how tall a person is, okay? We don't actually want to know all of those complicated things. We just want to know like some kind of simplified representation. Like if you got tall parents, you're going to be tall. If you got short parents, you're going to be short in general, okay? And we want to represent that maybe mathematically, okay? And we'll say like your height is going to be, you know, what we would predict your height to be will be like the average of your mom's height and your average of your dad's height, you know, assuming, I guess, if you have a mom and dad, and, you know, plus or minus something for like, it will account for your sex or gender, and I don't know, something like that, right? And this is what we want to go for, okay? This is the model, some kind of simplified mathematical representation to kind of get some values here, okay? But, you know, obviously, so let's say the model that we have is that a person's height is going to be determined by their parents' height and their gender, okay? Obviously, you can have two brothers in the same family with different heights, okay? But their input variables are the same, okay? You've got the same mother's height, the same father's height, same gender, but their height that they end up with ends up being different. And so to account for differences that is not included in our model, we include this term E for our error term, okay? To just kind of say like this is leftover differences, you know, after we take into account what our model says. And so this is what statistical learning is not, we're not going to worry about this part so much. We're going to just assume this has a mean of 0. We're going to just focus in on this F. How do we figure out the relationship between, you know, the values that come in, mother's height, father's height, gender, and the output variable, the height of the person, and things like that. Okay, and so here's a plot. This is looking at the relationship between years of education and income. And this is the actual data. And this is simulated data. So, you know, we're just looking at like this person has 10 years of education, meaning they didn't finish high school. And then this person has 22 years of education, meaning I guess they finished high school and had 10 additional years of schooling or something. And so anyway, this is simulated. And so this blue line represents the true relationship between years of education and income, okay? Generally, this blue line is unknown to us. Because it's simulated, we know what it is. But in real life, we don't know what this blue line, this true relationship is. And we can see that the values that show up in our data, you know, all have some kind of error around the blue line. And if we were to take the mean of all of these errors, some are above the line, some are below the line. If we take the mean of all of these things, the mean should be around 0. Okay? And anyway, the idea is, can we, looking at this, can we figure out what the blue line is? Okay? And that's basically what we're going to do in this course. It's all about, can we figure out this blue line looking only at this data? Okay? And this is a very simple example with just one input variable, years of education, and one output variable, income, but we'll look at situations where it gets, you know, more complicated. All right, so, you know, why do we want to bother trying to figure out this blue line? Okay, the two main reasons are prediction or inference, or what I like to say is insight, okay? And these are kind of your main purposes behind figuring out a model. Okay. As far as prediction goes, we are going to make some kind of curve that estimates the true thing, right? We don't know exactly what it's going to be. And that's going to be the function that we estimate, our f hat. This is going to represent the our estimate of the true function. And basically, this function now becomes our prediction. Okay, and so it just says, given these inputs, we're going to predict this. And what we ideally want is that we want our estimates, our y hats, to be as close to the actual values as possible. And in situations like this, we can often get away with treating our function f hat as a black box. Like, we don't actually care what happens inside of it. We just want to get good predictions. Okay, so that you have, we're not going to cover neural networks in this course, but neural networks often behave like black boxes. Okay, you got data coming in. We really have no idea what's happening inside, but it spits out a value, and what we want is just the value that it spits out to be a good, to be accurate. Okay, and we don't really care what else it does. And so so that's the idea of prediction, is that we just want to get we want the values that our model produces to be good estimates. Okay, when we look at y hat, there's going to be two parts to this. There's reducible error and there's irreducible error. Okay, the reducible error is going to be the difference between what our estimate is, the f hat, and the actual relationship f. Okay, and so this error can be reduced as f hat becomes more and more like the true relationship. So let me just pull up. So the idea is, just in our so this, again, this blue line represents the true relationship. And when we fit this, okay, maybe this is the line that we fit, okay? And so, I don't know what this looks like now. Something like that, right? And so the error that we see here, okay, part of it is because my green line that I drew here is not exactly like the blue line. Okay, there's a mismatch between the true relationship, the blue line, and what I've estimated, the green line. Okay, so that's what we call the reducible error, because effectively, as I improve my model, my green line might end up looking exactly like the true line, the blue line. Okay, and I mean, if we achieve that, then great, we did a good job. But even if I achieve guessing the blue line perfectly, so effectively, at some point maybe I get my my estimated model to match the true model perfectly. Okay, even then, there's still going to be error between the actual values and what I predict. Okay, because there's just inherent variation that exists in the data, right? So we might figure out the exact relationship between the nature of, a mother's height and father's height and the gender of the person and the resulting height that they take on. Okay, but again, there's just other things that our model doesn't account for. Things like individual differences, right? Two brothers have the same gender and same parents, but they have different heights, okay? That is going to be part of the irreducible error. That's something that we can't get rid of because our model doesn't take into account the whole world. It just takes into account the variables that we are looking at. And so we'll never get rid of the irreducible error, okay? So as our estimate, f hat becomes more like f, the reducible error will go down, but there's always some residual error e that's not captured by our model f, okay? So even if we get a very good estimate of f, we can't reduce the error introduced by e. So that's what we've got. Okay, and so if we talk about, what's the expected error? So this is like the squared error between the true value y and y hat. This will become the expected value of, y is f of x plus epsilon. Okay, this is the actual value of y. And then this is the predicted value, f hat of x, okay? So that's what this becomes, and we can rearrange terms. Okay, we can rearrange terms, and so basically we've got the f minus f hat of x. This is kind of the reducible error. This is the difference between what we have, and then the expected value of e squared is the variance of e, because e has a mean of 0, right? The epsilon, the errors have a mean of 0, so the expected value of e squared ends up being the variance of e. And so, and this part is irreducible. So it breaks down into this. Okay, so that's one reason why is we want to get good predictions, and just keep in mind that, you'll never get perfect predictions because there's generally always going to be something that we can't account for, some information that's not available to us, right? And then the other part is for inference or insight is that we might want to be interested in the actual relationship that exists between x and y, okay? And this is kind of the part that plays into interpretability. So, we might have questions like, which predictors are associated with the response, right? So we might have this housing data set, and we want to know, like, which predictors are actually responsible for the cost of the house. Does it matter how many bathrooms you have, or is it more important to know how many bedrooms you have, or who knows, right? For the I think for the final project, I'm gonna have you look at some sports data. I'm gonna take it from the NFL. I'm working this out because I want it to be a competition in terms of Kaggle, and you guys, I'll probably have you guys team up in twos or something, in pairs or individuals or whatever, and then you'll submit your model and try to outperform other people. But it's like real data, and I don't want you guys to cheat, and I'm not sure how this is gonna. I have to think of ways to kind of prevent some issues. And cheating, not like being dishonest, but like knowing the answers. So anyway, I think we'll have time at the end of today's class, and I'll describe more of what I have in mind here. Okay, so we want to know what predictors are associated with the response, and what is the relationship between the response and each predictor. So maybe you figure out it's not the bathrooms, but it's the bedrooms that matter. And what's the relationship between the response and each predictor? And you can say, well, every time you add a bedroom to a house, we can predict that the house will go up, $7,000. I have no idea. Okay, that probably doesn't it's probably closer to 30,000 or something, right? So each additional bedroom adds $30,000 to the price of the house or something like that. What's the relationship between the response and each predictor? That's what we can do. Or, you know, can we use a linear relationship? Is the relationship linear? Or do we need something more complicated? Do we need like curvy functions, things like that? So we might be interested in not just making predictions. Okay, predictions are always nice, but maybe learning something about this, right? We want to learn about the relationship between these variables. Okay, so how do we go about doing something like this? How do we estimate this function f, this true function that exists but is unknown to us? So, you know, we're going to say we've got some data coming in, okay? This is what we call the training data, all right? And we've got the x's and we've got the y's. The x's themselves are vectors consisting of multiple values, so you might have p different variables, and so each observation, so x sub I, so like x sub 1 will be the first observation, and if you have p different variables, like if you have 50 variables, you know, observation 1 for x will be a vector of 50 values. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to apply some kind of statistical learning method so that to take the inputs of x and get some kind of value y, and basically we just want to figure out f hat so that when we plug in our x values into f hat, our estimate of the model, we're going to get values that are close to the actual values of y. This is the goal. All right. This is just a very simplified idea. Just we want to take our inputs x, apply some kind of function to it, and get some kind of value y out of it. Okay. And broadly speaking, we can say our learning methods can be parametric or non-parametric. Okay. All right, so a parametric method involves two steps. Okay, the first step is that we have to make an assumption about the functional form of f. Okay, so we are saying that the function f, the true model, takes on some sort of form. Okay, and so one example is you're going to assume that f is a linear model, and if you assume f is a linear model, then you're going to say it's, you know, you're basically adding some each of your x input variables multiplied by some constant. Okay, saying that if you increase xi by 2, you know, the value in f is going to go up by 2 times b1 and things like that. If you change x2 by 1, the value in f is going to change by beta 2 times 1 and something like that. Okay, obviously we're not going to just cover linear models, we'll cover other models, but you are making some kind of assumption about the functional form of f. We're saying it follows this thing, like a linear model or a polynomial model, or it follows this, you know, even a neural network is just this complicated function. Okay, it's just a functional thing, and we're saying the relationship between x and y takes on this exact function. Okay, and then so once you make an assumption about what this function looks like, then training a model becomes just a matter of estimating what beta 0, beta 1, beta 2, beta through p should be. Okay, so remember, so out in the universe there's like infinitely many possible functional shapes, And now we're going to say we are going to limit ourselves to just one of the infinitely many linear functional shapes, okay? So there's still like infinitely many functions, but now they're all linear, okay? And now these linear functions are defined by just the parameters like the slope and the intercept and things like that. And now we only just have to estimate what that thing should be. And so if we were doing least squares regression, then the way we estimate our parameters in the linear model is we are trying to choose the beta 0 and the beta 1 and the beta 2 so that the squared residual between our model and our predicted values and the actual values, that the squared residuals are minimized. Okay, and we'll cover other methods for estimating parameters other than just least squares, ordinary least squares. But that's the general idea, is you've simplified the problem. It's not some arbitrary function. It's got to be a function of this exact form, and then you have to figure out what the parameters are. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's like a whole bunch of these things. So yeah, the parametric approach reduces the problem of estimating the function to just estimating these parameters, okay? And because it's a lot easier to figure out the estimates of, 10 parameters than it is to estimate some truly arbitrary function, okay? The problem is that if the functional form we select does not match the true form of f, our model is not going to do a good job of predicting or giving us proper insight, okay? So if you assume that the function is linear, then the insights you get will just be linear in nature, okay? And for a linear relationship, that means increasing x by 1 has the same effect everywhere, and most things in life are not linear, right? Going from having 0 kids to 1 kid is a big change, and going from 1 kid to 2 kids is a big change, is a different kind of change, and going from 2 kids to 3 kids is a different kind of change. But going from like 7 kids to 8 kids is probably going to feel different than going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 or things like that, right? So increasing the number of children by 1 is not going to have a linear effect on whatever it is we're talking about, okay? Other things might be linear, right? Like the cost of, how much you have to pay for how much meat you buy, that's probably going to be linear, right? You buy 2 pounds of meat, it's going to cost twice as much as buying 1 pound of meat. If you buy 3 pounds of meat, it's going to cost, the same, the difference between 1 pound and 2 pounds is the difference between 2 pounds and 3 pounds, right? Unless they apply some kind of bulk discount, and then now you have a nonlinear effect. So anyway, the idea is, if you're assuming that the relationship is linear, all of your insights or your inferences will be linear. And if that assumption is wrong, then you're going to run into trouble, okay? But estimating a linear relationship is quite easy. All you have to do is estimate the slope, all right? There's only one parameter that you got to figure out, okay? And so anyway, what do we do if the functional form doesn't match the true form, right? Well, what you can do is, rather than using these rigid models, you can use a very flexible model, right? So rather than just a linear relationship, you can, bring in, you can say, well, let's bring in polynomials and stuff. And it's still linearly related, but now you have polynomial terms and stuff. And so you can bring in these more flexible models. Neural networks are just more flexible models. But having a very flexible model can lead to overfitting, okay? And overfitting, we'll talk about this later, is the idea that there's some kind of noise in the data, some kind of coincidence that appears in your data, and if you overfit, it means you believe that the noise is actually part of the model. So perhaps coincidentally in your data, it turned out that all the houses that have I don't know, 4.5, I don't know, like let's say 3.5 bathrooms, for some reason, because you can have half bathrooms, we'll say, in your data set, you happen to have a bunch of houses with 3.5 bathrooms, and for whatever reason, they happen to cost less than the houses with 3 bathrooms or something, right? And if you overfit, now you're going to walk away with the conclusion that adding that half bathroom is actually going to decrease the value of your home, okay? And that's probably not the case. It's just a coincidence in the data that, the homes that had 3.5 bathrooms, for whatever reason, there was something weird about them. Their average value was less than the homes with 3 bathrooms or something. And overfitting is going to lead you to say like, oh, okay, house prices go up as you increase the number of bathrooms, but then if you go from 3 to 3.5, we got to bring the price down. Okay, that doesn't really make sense from an intuitive standpoint, but a very flexible model might come away with that kind of conclusion. So you don't want to do that. Okay. So the other approach is the non-parametric method. Okay. So non-parametric methods don't make any assumptions about the functional form of f. Okay, we're not going to say there's a linear relationship. We're not going to say the function has this thing. Okay, so you don't. So when you have a linear model, you get to write something out like this. Okay, with a non-parametric model, you don't get to write what the function looks like. Okay, you don't get to write out what the function looks like, but you still have a model. You still have a way to take inputs and produce some kind of estimated output value. Okay, so the advantage is that non-parametric methods can fit, pretty much any shape of f. Okay, so f doesn't have a linear shape. Non-parametric method says, okay, that's fine. We'll deal with it, okay? So you don't have to worry about using the wrong functional form. You don't have to say, like, do I have to worry about, is linear response the right model to fit, right? I think in 101A you spent a lot of time talking about checking your model assumptions, right? Things like when you fit a linear model, you want to make sure that your variance is uniform and there's no pattern in the residuals and stuff. And that's all to make sure that this assumption that you're making here is a valid assumption. Okay? With the non-parametric method, there's no assumptions to check. You didn't make any assumptions in the first place. Okay? The disadvantage, though, is that because you're making fewer assumptions, you generally need more data to make an accurate model. Okay? And so, a non-parametric method is something like, k-nearest neighbors or something. Just take the average of something around you and use that. These are non-parametric methods, and they can work. But so there's no assumptions to check, but you generally need more data. All right, so here is just some example pictures straight from the textbook that kind of illustrate these ideas, okay? So this is now, so again, this is simulated data, right? So earlier we looked at the relationship between years of education and income, okay? And we have this kind of, S-shaped curve. And now we have this thing, which is, now we're looking at the relationship between income with years of education and seniority, okay? And again, this is simulated data, so we know the true relationship, okay? So we know the true relationship. This is generally, the true relationship is generally something that is not known to us. But this is simulated, so we know the actual shape, and we added some random noise to get our red points, okay? So the red dots are the values in our training data, and even though we know the true relationship, there's still some error, okay? There's some difference between what the true model says it should be and what the actual value is, okay? So that's the irreducible error that we can't get rid of, okay? And what we want is we want to be able to estimate what this blue surface is, right? So looking at only the red dots, can we figure out what this blue sheet should look like? Okay, so this is what would happen if we fit a linear model. Okay, a linear model says basically, in three-dimensional space you're going to fit a plane, or in higher dimensional space you're going to fit a hyperplane. Okay, linear models basically just straight lines or flat surfaces. Okay, and so this is a linear model, and overall it gets the general trend, right? Like more years of education, higher income. All right, that's the general trend. More seniority, higher income. It gets that general trend. But in the true model, there's some curvature, right? It's, the increase in years of education has a different effect, at different points, right? Once you get out to here, adding more years of education doesn't really make a huge difference. And, this is kind of the critical region where having more years of education does make a difference in income and stuff like that. And as far as seniority goes, there's one region where having a few more years of seniority makes a bigger difference in income. Okay, so that's the true relationship. The linear relationship or linear model doesn't capture that. It just says more years of education, more money. Okay, throughout the whole thing. Okay, and so we miss some important curvature, but this is what we get. All right. This is a non-parametric model. This is called a thin plate spline model, okay, and we'll see what this looks like. And basically, we just say fit a sheet, okay. Imagine you've got some kind of rubbery sheet, and when you specify the thin plate spline model, you can give it this kind of smoothness parameter, and you say I want it to be pretty smooth, okay. And so it's going to it's going to try to keep the surface smooth, and at the same time it's going to try to minimize the errors between the red dots and the surface. Okay, and so this is what we get. Again, this is the true model. This is the non-parametric fit, and we see the non-parametric fit does a pretty decent job of estimating the true model. It's not exactly the same. Okay, non-parametric fit, true model, they are a little bit different, but it does a decent job, right? Okay. As far as non-parametric models go, you can change the way the non-parametric model is going to fit, and so over here we fit a non-parametric model, and we said so it's the same thing. It's a thin plate spline model. But this time we said, the resulting surface does not have to be smooth. Just try to fit the data that we have as close as possible. Okay, that's what we kind of said. We said fit the data we've got as close as possible, all right? And so when we do this, if you look, there's no errors between the red dots and the surface, okay? I mean, it's a little hard to see, but all of these red dots, the surface touched the red dots exactly, okay? And so we actually have 0 training error, right? But if we compare this surface with this surface and the true model, we see that this one, the one that was a little bit more restrictive, saying we want it smooth, and it's okay if you have some errors left over, that does a better job of fitting the actual true model than this one, which has all of these kind of hills and valleys that are maybe a little bit artificial, right? They're just results of our training data. In our training data, this person, for whatever reason, earns a little bit less money than they probably should, okay, according to their years of education and seniority. Maybe they upset somebody in HR and so they didn't get the promotion or something. Well, we don't know what happened, okay? So this person makes a little bit less money, and if we were to use this as our model, then the next time somebody comes in our data and says, I've got this much education, this much seniority, we're going to make a bad prediction. We're going to say, okay, well, you should make the same amount as this other person who nobody in HR likes. And they'll be like, well, this is lame. So this is not having a very flexible model that minimizes the error in your training data may not actually be a desirable feature, because it's not going to get the true model. Okay. Over here, we have the inflexible model that doesn't get the true thing, and so the idea is, we're going to talk about in our class like some of these different things, and we want to get something in the kind of the happy medium zone of like not too inflexible and not too flexible. Okay, we want something in between, because usually it's the things that are in between that do a good job of modeling the true relationship, which is what we want. Okay, does that kind of make sense? All right, and so this gets at the idea between, the trade-off between prediction accuracy and model interpretability. Okay, and so so the question is like, would we ever want the more restrictive model instead of the very flexible approach? All right, and the answer is yeah. We might. Like, would we ever want to use linear regression? Like, will we want this instead of this or this? Okay. Well, if you want inference, then restrictive models are easier to interpret, right? If you want to know, like, what's the effect that adding a bathroom has on the house, a linear model is going to help that out easily, okay? And you can have something that's, you can use a spline thing, but then the question is like, all right, what effect does a year of education have? Your answer is a little bit more tricky, right? Okay. These more restrictive models are less prone to overfitting, okay? And then highly flexible models often require lots of data for an accurate fit. So if you don't have a ton of data, then it's better to make a lot of assumptions about the functional form, because then you'll get a better fit. And of course, every time you make an assumption, you have the risk of making, your assumption is bad. But sometimes you just accept and say, well, I know it's not linear in real life, but I'm going to pretend that it's linear, and I'm going to accept the consequences of pretending that it's linear, right? Just to kind of make my life easier. So we can say, like, I know that additional years of service, more seniority at the workplace is not a linear thing. That every time, the difference between working somewhere 25 years and 26 years is not the same as the difference between working 4 years and 5 years or something. You can say, I know that it's not a linear relationship, but just to kind of keep things easier, I'm going to treat it like linear. And I'm going to say every year I work here, I can expect something around an extra $2,000 in annual income or something like that. I don't know. So that's what we've got. Okay, so these are going to be some of the models that we'll look at. And so we've got subset selection and lasso and least squares. Those are high interpretability and low flexibility, and I think you've learned subset selection and least squares, which talks, like choosing this subset of variables, and you've got least squares regression for kind of your linear models. And lasso is almost like subset selection, but it pushes some variables down to 0 and stuff like that. So they have high interpretability, but less flexibility. You got things in between, like your generalized additive models, which we'll take a look at, along with tree-based models, your random forest and things like that. Oh, I'm sorry, the decision trees are somewhere in between, and then you'll have more flexibility and less interpretability once you get into things like the random forest or bagging and boosting, and then you've got support vector machines, And we're not going to cover neural networks, but they offer high flexibility, but very little interpretability, okay? Unless you go into neural network neuroscience or something like that, which might be developing or something. Okay. A lot of these methods can generally be classified into supervised versus unsupervised learning, okay? And so supervised learning basically means we've got the response, we've got a y, and so we can take our inputs x, and we can make predictions of y hats, and we can compare the y hats with the y's, and we can see how right or how wrong we are, okay? So we know the right answer, and we can see, we feed it through our function and our method, and we get some prediction. We can make a comparison between what we predicted and what the actual value was. Okay, so that's supervised learning. We can make these comparisons. Okay, in unsupervised learning, okay, and most of the methods we learn in our class is going to be supervised learning, and I think that's going to be most of your. I don't know about most, but a lot of machine learning things are supervised learning problems. Okay, but then on the other hand, there's important stuff on unsupervised learning. And in unsupervised learning, only the x values are observed, okay? Only the x. So in these cases, we're looking for structure in the data, things like clustering. So in clustering, you're just trying to group people or group observations into similar observations. You're going to say, like, let's make a group here. I'm going to put, like, if you're clustering video games, you might say, like, let's put, I don't know, Call of Duty and, I don't know, whatever shooting video games you got. PUBG and Fortnite and stuff like that, right? And you might cluster both of those together, and then you might say, all right, and then let's put like Candy Crush and, I don't know, whatever puzzle games together, right? And you might kind of form these different things, and you have casual games and stuff. And there's no right answer for how these things should be clustered, right? And then you might say, like, okay, well, these games should be clustered further together and stuff. And so that's unsupervised. You don't have the answers. You're just trying to find some kind of structure, okay? Because probably some structure does exist in the data, but you got to figure that out yourself, okay? And then the other division of methods is splitting methods between regression and classification, okay? And overall, as far as supervised learning goes, the general rule is if your output variable is a number, it's going to be a regression problem. And if your output variable is categorical, it's a classification problem, okay? So if you want to predict the price of a house, that's a regression problem. If you want to predict the amount of money a customer will spend, that's a regression problem. If you want to predict, any kind of numeric quantity, how many points the team will score, if you want to predict how much, a lot of times we're trying to predict money type of things, or, what percentage will do something, that's going to, well, I guess percentage is a weird thing. It could be a classification thing also. But those are going to be all regression problems, okay? Classification will be categorical situations. So if you want to take the input is a bunch of words and you want to predict if it's spam or not, that's going to be a classification problem. Or if you want to try to determine if somebody's going to be able to pay off their loan, or if they're going to fall into default, meaning they didn't pay, that's a classification problem, okay? You've got other classification problems, right? Like, is this, based on this image, do you think this tumor is cancerous or not? Based on this thing, is this person going to buy my product or not, okay? Those are all classification problems. I think like on Kaggle, one of the introductory problems is, does the person survive the Titanic or not, right? You've got a bunch of passengers on the Titanic, and you want to find out, does this person survive or not, right? And that's a classification, okay? All right, so as far as supervised learning problems go, all of these methods are driven by some way of measuring model accuracy, because we want to ultimately ask, is my model any good, right? Because the whole idea is we want to be able to make a model, okay? But we don't know the true form. We don't know the true form. We're just trying to estimate it. But then we want to know, is my estimate of the model, is this any good? Okay, so how do we measure something like that? Okay, so probably the most common measure of this quality of fit is going to be the mean squared error, okay, your MSE, and then you've got everything that's related to it, right? Your root mean squared error is you take the square root of this. You've got like your sum of squared errors or something, things like that. But mean squared error is generally a common choice, and is probably the most common one for regression problems. And basically, it's just, what was the actual value? What did your model predict? Let's take those differences and let's square them. And then you're going to sum those up, divide by n. So you just take the average of these squared errors. Because, and this is how we're going to decide whether the model we've picked is good or bad, and this is how we're also going to drive how to estimate these parameters and stuff. We want to pick the model that's going to have the smallest amount of mean squared error. We want this difference between the actual value and what we predict. We want that difference to be as small as possible. So we want models with the minimum or smallest mean squared error, okay? But there's an issue here, okay? And that is, when we fit the model to the training data, we might say, please minimize the squared error, okay? But we only have the training data. The training data, again, is all the data that we are using to create our estimate of the model, right? We're trying to figure out what the parameters should be, or we're trying to figure out what this shape should be, or the surface should be. All of that is based on the data that we have, okay? And we might say, get your model to minimize the distance between the actual value and the predicted value for this data that we have. That seems reasonable, okay? But a lot of times, we don't want to just stop there. We don't want to just be able to predict the data that we have. We want to say, okay, now that I have this model, if a new observation comes in, a new thing that I've never seen, can I make a good prediction, right? So we've got a bunch of data, and we say, all right, I looked at all of these people, and I know who was able to pay off their loan and who wasn't able to, right? But that's happened in the past, right? I lost money on the people who couldn't pay off their loans, and I made some interest off of the people who did pay off their loan. And so, but that's all in the past. What I want to be able to do is take all of this information and say, all right, here's a new person, a new customer. They're applying for a loan. Should I give them money and expect them to pay me back? Or should I give them money and lose it because they didn't pay me? They're not going to pay me back, right? And so I want to make predictions for data that I haven't seen, okay? And so we're going to call this our test data, okay? And the real test data is when you have your model and you use it on real data that comes in the future. The real test data exists in the future, okay? But a lot of times, we can't predict the future, so we have to kind of figure this out for ourselves. So a lot of times we'll take all the data that we have, and we'll split it between kind of training data and test data, and we will fit our model on the training data, and then we will use the data that we didn't use to train our model and see how well it makes predictions there, okay? But that's what we want. So over here, we say a lot of times we will fit our model and we'll say we want to pick the model so that y hats end up as close to y, the actual y's as close as possible. However, the issue is that there's no guarantee that this model that does a good job between y hat and y, the actual and the prediction on the training data, will do just as well on the data that we haven't seen, right? And so there's we have to talk about strategies to use so that when we get a small mean squared error in our training data, that we'll also get the same desirable property of having a small mean squared error in our test data. Okay, so we want to be able to make predictions on data that we haven't seen yet, and we want our models to have that as well. Okay, and so kind of the in general, when we have a very flexible model, we can really lower the training mean squared error very well. Okay, so we can get, and we saw this kind of with our spline fits, and we'll look at a few more pictures here. Okay, so if we choose a very flexible model, we can often get the MSE in our training data to be very low. Okay, and so things, so just kind of, as a side note, these very flexible models can generate, a very wide range of possible shapes to estimate F, as it compared to, kind of the less flexible models. And so, we've already kind of mentioned this, but there's a trade-off between flexibility and interpretability, okay? But then, so even though we've minimized or really decreased the training MSE, the mean squared error on our test cases, the new data that was not used to train our data, might end up being a lot higher for the flexible model than for the simple version, like the linear regression one. Okay, and so I'm going to show you a few diagrams. Okay, and here we've got the true line in black, and then we've got the linear estimate will be an orange line, and then we're going to have two flexible ones, a smoothing spline and a smoothing spline with even more flexibility. Okay. And then on the right, we're going to have the training mean squared error and the test mean squared error. And then the dotted line will be the irreducible error. Okay. So here, this is too small. Let me. Okay. So, I don't know if you guys can see this. So this black line represents the true model, okay? And this is the data that we've observed, okay? And so this orange line represents what will happen if we fit just a very restrictive linear model to it. Okay, it does a bad job. It's not so great. Okay, in light blue, and it's kind of hard to see because it's underneath the black line, is the smoothing spline model. Okay, so that tries to fit the data points, the scattered data points, and it tries to fit that, and we get this blue smooth thing. Okay, so there's going to be some error there. And then this green line, which is all wiggly, is a very flexible smoothing spline. Okay, and so we can see that, because we've got some extreme values up here, this smoothing spline tries to minimize the error there. Okay, and so what we have here is in gray, this line represents the mean squared error of our training data. Okay, so when we have very little flexibility, okay, so on this line we've got flexibility, and I think it's for the smoothing splines, but basically when you have the very low flexibility, like the linear model, you've got lots of training error. Okay, And as we make the line more smooth, this the training error goes down. And as we made it even more flexible, the training error goes down even further. Okay. All right, so that's what we have. So if our goal was just to minimize the training data, then we would say, oh yeah, pick the most flexible line possible, because that's going to give us the minimum squared error. Because if we talk about this green line, yeah, the green line does the best as far as minimizing the distance between these dots and what the green line is. Okay, but if we were to generate new random data based on this true line, the black line, okay, then we can have test data. Okay, so we don't see it in this diagram, but you can imagine new random data appearing, okay, you know, kind of centered around this black line, the test data. And what we see is that with the inflexible model, the new test data has more squared error. As we increase the flexibility of the model, the blue line has less error for the test data, okay? But as we create our green line, okay, that ends up having more test error because we've made it too flexible, right? So the green line doesn't do a good job of predicting new cases that we haven't, that are generated from this black line. Okay, so the green line ends up having more mean squared error. Same thing happens in this diagram. Okay, so here the true thing is almost linear. Okay, it's the black line, there's a little bit of curvature to it. Okay, and so having the linear model, the orange line with the least amount of flexibility, has about this much mean squared error. Okay, and then giving it a smooth spline, allowing a little bit of curvature, gives something a little bit different. This blue line, which is, it's hard to see because it's almost exactly the same as the black and the orange lines. Okay, that does decrease our mean squared error a tiny bit. Okay, and then we've got the very flexible green line, which does a very good job of predicting these points that deviated from the black line, the true model, right? So we've got the green line does a good job of minimizing the errors there, and so we can see that for the for the training data, we've really minimized our squared errors there. Okay, but when it comes to test data, so we're going to use the black line and random noise around the black line to generate new data. We see that, you know, the blue line and the orange line have very similar performance. There's like hardly any difference here. Okay, and then but you know, this green line, which we made very flexible because we just had this one-track mission of minimizing the training error, ends up doing really bad when it comes to unforeseen data, the test cases. Okay, and this kind of just reflects the idea that what we want is, we don't want to just fit the training data. We want to fit the true model. Okay, and we don't know what this true model is, right? All of these things we can see easily because this is all simulated data, and we know what this black line looks like. Okay, so we know what the true model looks like. But the question is, you know, what's going to perform well in the future? And so, you know, in these cases, it's easy to see that the green line is bad. But in real life, you don't know. You don't know. You don't know if the data you have is reflective of the true model, or there's a lot of noise and you're just fitting noise. Okay. There's another one of these pictures, but I think you guys get the point. Okay. So the straight line is obviously a bad choice. So it's got a ton of error in both the training and the test case. Okay. Adding flexibility drastically improves the training and the test error performance. Okay, and adding too much flexibility decreases the error in the training data, but actually increases the error in our test data. Okay, but the very flexible bad model is still much better than the very inflexible straight line model. Okay, and all of these things depend on kind of your metrics for how we measure what's a good and what's a bad model. Okay, and so for regression problems, we generally use mean squared error. Okay, and so all of this gets at this idea of the bias variance trade-off. Okay. And so the bias basically refers to the error that is that we get by modeling the problem in real life by a much simpler problem, right? So in real life, what determines someone's height is very complicated. There's like a biological process, there's genetics, and how much nutrition you had, and how much time you spent jumping up and down, and how much time you slept, and there's all sorts of complicated things, right, in real life. And we're trying to model it with something simpler, either a linear model or a flexible model or whatever it might be. There's going to be some inherent difference between what's happening in real life, which is responsible for the test data and stuff, and what we get. Okay, and so so the bias is going to be basically the difference between your model and what the real relationship is. Okay, and in general, if you got a very flexible or complex model, you're going to have less bias. Okay, you're going to be able to fit the real model in the long run much better. Okay, so so in these diagrams, like this very flexible green model, it feels like this does a bad job of fitting the black line, right? But if we were to generate like thousands of different data sets around this black line, and we used a very flexible green line model, okay, that fits the data points like very well, overall, if we averaged all of the different green lines, so I've got this very flexible green line that looks like this, I get a different data set and I get another flexible green line, okay, and I do this and I get all these very flexible green lines. If I average them all, the average of all of those things will probably look a lot like the true model. Okay, so in the long run, the very flexible model we can expect to reflect the true model. Okay, as far as the training data goes. Okay, even though for one instance it does a bad job, right? So if we're talking about kind of like the average of the very flexible models, we're going to have that. Okay. The variance, though, is the idea of how much does one model vary from another model, or like how much does one fit vary from another fit if I gave a different training data set. So again, taking a look at this, if I had a different random data set, probably my green line will look very different for the other data set than this one, right? Because my like, maybe I can illustrate this. Okay, so I'm going to say the true model, I shouldn't. True model will be, hold on, all right, so we'll say X will be a sequence from 0 to 5 by 0.01. And the true model will be, I don't know, x cubed minus 3x squared plus 4x. I don't know, what does this look like? It's too much. How do I make it more? Okay, so let's say this is our true model, okay? And then so what I'm gonna do is observed y observed will be true model plus some noise. So we're gonna just do r norm length of x. All right, so we'll plot points x and y observed. I'll do color equals red, and PCH equals 19, and CX equals 0.3. Oh, that's too much noise. Okay. All right, let's try this again. Okay, that's fine. All right, and then I think I can do low s y observed by x. This will be like model 1, and then I'll do plot, or I'll do, I'm sorry, lines x and predict model 1 color equals, we'll do blue. Did that not work? Oh, is it low s? Oh. Sorry. Okay, so that's one thing, right? Okay, and we'll do the same thing here. Model 2, but this time I'll do green, and then let me look up the help on low s. Span. You guys see that? Maybe we'll make it like super flexible. Okay. All right, let me just delete all of these plots. Okay, can you guys see this green line? Okay, so the idea here is that, you know, here's one thing, and if I had just a different training data set, okay, so if I did this exact same thing, so same model, different training data, okay, I'm going to just change my seed to 2, and I'll produce this. Okay, so if we compare this versus this, okay, so the true model is exactly the same. Our training data changes, okay, and if you look at the blue line doesn't change very much, right? But if you look at the green line changes drastically, okay? Now, if we were to do this like 1,000 different times, we're gonna get 1,000 different wiggly green lines. The average of all of these 1,000 different wiggly green lines will probably average out to the true model, the black line, quite well, okay? However, the blue line, you might notice that in both cases, so if you look at the green line, it's like centered around the black line throughout the whole thing, okay? It's like centered around the black line the whole thing. In this case, it's also centered around the black line the whole time. Indicating that there's kind of low bias. And if we did this 1,000 times, and if we averaged all the green lines together, we're probably going to get something that resembles the black line almost perfectly, okay? If we look at the blue line, okay, it tends to kind of it's not as flexible, right? So you can imagine this kind of I don't know, this cable that, like, it's hard to, like, I've got this cable here, and it's like I can't make like really tight corners on the cable, okay? Versus like the green line, I can make like really wiggly corners and stuff like that, right? So this green line, it's like this piece of string that I can like wiggle really tight, and then I don't know, you can imagine just this fat jumper cable that I'm like, it's hard to bend, okay? And so, so we're getting this kind of thing where like in both graphs, in this graph and this graph, the blue line kind of underestimates over here and maybe tends to overestimate over here, okay? And if I did this again, like I'll just to kind of drive this point home, same exact thing, different training data will fit all of this, okay? So now I've got 3 graphs, all right? 1, 2, 3, whoops, okay, yeah. 1, 2, 3, and in all 3 graphs, the blue line underestimates the black line in this section, okay? So there's bias there, okay? The blue line, as best as it fits the data, it's going to be biased towards underestimating the true model in this segment, and it's going to be biased towards overestimating the values in this section, okay? So we've got bias here. However, if you look at how much does the blue line change from one training set to another training set, it doesn't change very much. You've got less variance there, okay? How much does the green line change from this model to this model to this model? They're like totally different, okay? You've got high variance, okay? And so this is kind of the idea of the bias variance trade-off, is that a less flexible model in the long run is going to be biased. It's not going to fit the true model very well. But it's going to be fairly consistent. We look at this blue line from one to another, they look almost exactly the same, right? If I just showed you this blue line and this blue line and this blue line, you're going to have a hard time knowing which one came from which, okay? If you look at the green line, though, they're very, very different, okay? So you got high variance in the very flexible model. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of this idea of bias and variance. And we can kind of split up the expected test, the mean squared error for unseen training data, okay? For test mean squared error, okay? Y0 representing kind of our unseen training data, it's going to be the variance of the function itself. Like how much does one predictive thing vary from another? So how much do the green lines change from one to another? Versus the bias, how different is the fitted line from the true line, okay, in the long run, right? The blue line, how different is the blue line from the black line, and all of those things. That's the bias, okay? And then there's always irreducible error, because there's just noise, and no matter what you do, you're gonna get some noise. So that's the kind of the bias variance trade-off. It's the idea that you can either have a model that, and so something, you want to get something in between. So here, you know, the blue line I think does a decent job, but you know, every time we fit it, as if we look at this segment of the model or of the data, it's consistently underestimating. There's a bias in terms of the values that it gets, okay? But little variance, they don't change very much. The wiggly lines change drastically from one training set to another. Okay, so that's assessing model performance for regression data is the mean squared error. We just measure how different the data is from its prediction, and we square it. That's often the case. And then, and I was making slides this morning and I ran out of time. So the other part is, if we are talking about a classification problem, we've got the classification error rate, okay? And the classification error rate is basically how many mistakes did you make, okay? Or what proportion is a mistake? So this is supposed to be yi with a actual hat, not hat. I don't know what happened there. Okay, put a hat over yi rather than writing hatty I. Okay, if the actual value is not equal to our prediction, that's going to be a mistake, right? If the actual thing was, it's not cancer, but we predicted that it's cancer or something, then that's a mistake. And it's going to be basically the sum of all of these things divided by how many observations. So what proportion did you make a mistake in classifying? Okay. We've got kind of k-nearest neighbors. And here's a few diagrams. Okay, so this diagram represents kind of the true boundary for a classification problem, okay? That we have I guess, actually this is not, I guess, the Bayes decision boundary, but anyway, we've generated some data, okay? And sometimes you get blue versus orange, and this is kind of the boundary between these regions. And what we want to do is we want to be able to estimate kind of something, all right? And so the way k-nearest neighbors works is you've got what it does is it's going to say here, we'll look at the k equals 1, okay? It's going to like take this dot, and it's going to say, what is the closest observation to this dot right here, okay? And it's going to say, all right, the closest observation to this dot is this purple line, or purple circle. So therefore, this dot is going to get classified as purple. As I move, say, over here, okay, right here, what's the closest observation? Well, there's two that are very close. There's a purple one and there's an orange one. And because this one, the orange one, is ever so slightly closer, this dot right here gets classified as orange, okay? And same as, so like right here, okay, here's an observation, probably should be orange, but because we used k equals 1, it says, what's the closest neighbor to this dot? The closest neighbor is not this point or this point or this point. It's this purple one. So it's going to get classified as purple right there. Okay, so this is k equals 1. And so if you used k equals 1, which is kind of very highly flexible, you get this decision boundary that looks kind of terrible, okay? In that, like, because one observation was purple here, all of these dots in this zone end up getting classified as purple, okay? Over here, whoops, apparently I can highlight these. Over here, we've got the other extreme. We said k equals 100, okay? K equals 100. And so what we're doing is we're going to pick a dot here, and we're going to say, what are the 100 closest observations to this dot? And I don't know what we are, right? So we go through and we figure out the 100 closest observations, and we say, okay, how many are orange, how many are purple? And we're going to get like 55 orange and 45 purple or something like that. And we say, okay, the orange wins, therefore this dot gets classified as orange, okay? And so this zone right here, which probably should be purple, when we look at what are the 100 closest observations, when we look at the 100 closest observations, you get a whole bunch of orange dots, not a lot of purple dots, so they end up getting classified as orange, okay? Because we want the 100 closest. And so the decision boundary between orange and purple probably doesn't do a really good job, because it's going to say all of these things are orange and all of these things over here are purple, when in reality the boundary should probably be a little bit more nuanced, okay? And so you know, you can get something that's like a happy in between, and you say, well, don't look at just the one closest, don't look at the 100 closest, but maybe we'll choose something in between, like 10. What are the 10 closest observations? Okay, and we say, okay, well, for this dot, you know, what are the 10 closest observations? And it's a bunch of purple ones. Okay, maybe a couple of these orange, but mostly purple. And so this region gets purple. You know, what are the closest observations here? And it's mostly orange, and so these get orange, right? And so we can see that when we use k equals 10, the decision boundary ends up being a little bit closer to probably the real life boundary there. Okay, and so this is you know, k nearest neighbors as far as how it goes, and you know, when we want to measure, you know, what's the performance of this thing, the way we measure its performance, a simple way is to just use the misclassification error rate, and that looking at our data, you know, did it predict that this one was going to be blue or something? So here it would predict that this one should have been purple, and so that counts as an error, right? And here it's going to predict that this dot here is orange, and that's going to count as an error, and something like that. And you know, all of these things that end up on the wrong side, they're going to get misclassified, and so you'll have a certain error rate. Okay, but if you look at you know, k equals 100, you know, there's a lot that get misclassified. Okay, and similarly, so this is, you know, for our training data, and then we run a test data, and we just look at, you know, how many we get misclassified. Okay. That's all I've got for today. Just kind of talking about some of the stuff. I think in your 2 o'clock section, you'll meet your TA, Keshin, and she will, I think, work through the lab in chapter 2. You can expect, I'll post a homework assignment with problems assigned out of probably chapters 2 and 3, and you should be able to get started. And again, my encouragement is to try the homework problems out yourself first before searching online for answers. Okay, they're out there, and I can't stop anything I can't stop you guys from looking at them. But again, just like, think of it as working out at the gym, right? If you are unable to lift the weight or something, it's not going to help you. Or if you get tired of lifting weights, it's not going to help you if you have somebody else lift the weights for you. Okay, and the same way, it's not going to help you if you have somebody else do the answers for you. And I'll try to wrap up the syllabus, and I'll try to talk about the final projects and stuff. I guess let me just give you a glimpse or an idea of what how the final project is going to work. So the idea is I'm going to go to Kaggle, and I'm going to create a competition for our class, and probably you guys can work individually or as pairs, okay? Or, you know, if you want to work with one other student or something, because you know, there's only what, 20 something of you here, so I think we can have teams of 1 or 2. And what I'm going to do is I have to. So I'm going to create a competition, and the way a competition works is there will be training data with all of the inputs and the answers, and then there will be test data where you only have the inputs, okay? And then the outputs are secretly hidden inside the competition, and then and what Kaggle will do is it will measure, you upload your predicted outputs, Kaggle measures your predicted outputs against the true predicted outputs and measures the error there. I want to use real life data, but the problem with real life data is anything, like, I don't have access to secret data that you guys don't have access to. So the problem is I was going to use football data because I think it works, or I don't know, maybe I'll look for something else. The problem is that if I use the actual real life football data, you might be able to figure out the actual real life football data, and you might be able to, quote, make perfect predictions because you can look up the answers online. Like, does that make sense? Like, if I said, you know, how many wins did the, you know, 2002 Buffalo Bills get in their football season, and if that's one of the test cases that's going to get you evaluated, like you are able to look that number up directly somewhere online. And so what I think I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to introduce some noise into the data so that the numbers you have are like based on real data, but is not true real data that matches up with things in the real world. Exactly. It'll be like very similar, but a little bit different. And so, so I think I'm gonna have to introduce some noise that way. And so I'm working on that. There's no, it's, you know, the competition will end, you know, when class ends and things like that. So I'm figuring out the grading schemes for all of that. And we'll do that. Okay, so we'll end here for today, and we'll see you guys on Wednesday.